Naomi, just a few weeks ago before you came here, you wrote an article that ran in Rolling Stone, I believe, or maybe it was on The Guardian, maybe both. It was called From Seattle to Copenhagen. So you were drawing a line from the anti-globalization movement that had its coming out party at the Seattle WTO protests. And that was a moment in which people celebrated the end of single issue politics, right? Recognizing the intersections and connections between movements. Drawing that trajectory to today at the COP15 in Copenhagen, and it's a climate summit, but I think you raised a really valuable point, which is that climate is an umbrella through which there are so many movements that are connected. And I want to credit Tick, Tick, Tick for really focusing on building a broad-based movement that represents a diversity of perspectives and brings climate debt and justice into the frame. And George, you mentioned ClimateGate. And that is something that, you know, when we set up the Fresh Air Center and started to respond to the coverage that was coming out, a lot of partners were putting out some analysis and talking points, attempting to shift the frame from ClimateGate to Swift Hack. I don't know if it's stuck so much. But I think both of you raised some issues that point to essentially a coordinated campaign on the part of the opposition that it seems like it's really important to raise, right? There was, I think, one of the most strategic framing actions at the beginning of the COP happened on the part of the right in the fossil fuel industry, and that was the ClimateGate issue, right? To suggest that the science is debatable, and that seemed to have tainted in many ways the process where everyone's on the defensive, trying to sort of climb back. And months and months before this, even the right definitely dealt a blow to the climate movement when they took Van Jones down. So Van Jones, who came out of movements of peoples of color, communities of color, urban cities, and bringing in trade unions and the green jobs economy movement into the climate movement, and then ultimately bringing that perspective into the administration. And that was something that really hurt us in a pretty significant way. So I want to ask you, from your perspective as people who are sort of paying a lot of attention, eating, living, breathing, writing this about these issues. Where do you see the climate movement going from here? What is next? What would you like to see this room full of NGOs, activists, and bloggers with opinion do?
Somebody else start.
Okay. Thanks. No, thanks very much for those questions, which I think are really pertinent and very pertinent points. I would like to start off by suggesting that what we're seeing in this war, of which the ClimateGate is just one aspect, is much more than a war over climate change. This is a war between two profoundly divergent worldviews. Between the worldview of those people backed by very large amounts of corporate money and by AstroTurf campaigns and all sorts of devious tactics, but also mobilizing people who genuinely appear to feel this way, a movement of people who believe there should be no constraints on the way they live, who believe they should be able to do whatever they want, regardless of whose interests they might be trampling. In fact, who believe that trampling other people's interests is almost their human right. And they object ferociously to anyone who says, you may not swing your fist if someone else's nose is in the way. They object ferociously if you say, you can't destroy other people's lives in order to make a bit more money for yourself. They object ferociously if you say, you can't drive your Porsche at 100 miles an hour in this residential zone, you might run someone over. This is not just a war over climate change. This is a war over human decency and sheer bloody selfishness. That's the real dividing line here. And the party of sheer bloody selfishness is in the ascendant at the moment. And they're in the ascendant partly because they have the backing of big money, partly because people really don't want to face what we're confronted with. They don't want to know about the sheer scale of the challenges we face, because they suspect, as we know, that it is about more than just climate change. Climate change, as Naomi and many others have pointed out, that climate change is a symptom of the wider problems. It's a symptom of several problems, but I'll name just three. Economic growth. And this is the issue which underlies so much. You know, if climate change weren't an issue, if we weren't facing, well, let's not call it climate change, let's call it climate breakdown or climate crash. Let's call it what it really is. Calling it climate change is a bit like calling a foreign invasion unexpected visitors. Or a bombing campaign, the delivery of unwanted packages. Yeah, I mean, we're talking about an existential threat here. Climate breakdown is a mild term, and climate crash maybe begins to describe what we're discussing. But if it weren't this issue, it would be another one. You know, we've got a summit billed as the most important meeting that's ever taken place in the history of humanity to deal with the immediate crisis of climate change. But say, by some miracle, they deal with it and that crisis is completely solved, and there is no climate breakdown. In a few years' time, they'll be dealing with the crisis of peak oil, and then the crisis of fresh water, and the crisis of phosphate, and the crisis of soil, and a whole series of crises lined up behind this immediate crisis, which all have at their root the same problem, the belief that we can have perpetual growth on a finite planet. That is one of the fundamental underlying problems. Another one, of course, is corporate power, which drives that growth, but drives a particular version of that growth, and a particularly neoliberal version of that growth. Another one, of course, is the atomization of society and the sense that we only achieve validity through rising consumption. All these are some of the underlying things that we are fighting. And those of us who are on the side of urging restraint, of saying there have to be limits, otherwise you destroy other people's lives, we are fighting forces very much bigger than ourselves. But we are fighting it from our hearts as well as from our heads. We are fighting it from a position of genuine belief. We are fighting it from the knowledge, the absolutely certain knowledge, that unless we engage in this fight and win, we and our descendants will live in a far crueler, more brutal and more degraded place than we inhabit today. And it's because of that passion and because of that belief that despite the overwhelming force of numbers and issues and money against us, I think that eventually we will come out on top. But we will do so only if we are fully aware of what we are fighting here. We'll do so only if we bear in mind that this is not a battle over chemicals, about certain greenhouse gases which enter the atmosphere. This is a battle over humanity. It's about who we are, about who we want to be, about what we want our future to be, about what kind of ape we decide to become. And it's a battle which those who urge that human decency must be paramount must win. And those who urge that they should have a right to trash other people's life in pursuit of their own interests must lose. Only one of those sides can win. It must be us. Thanks.
I had a couple of thoughts about where we should be going and where we should be concentrating our energies, and I think we should look at what's working, you know. And in terms of thinking about how this conference became the conference where